In the year 1810, a single pound of sugar cost an English laborer nearly a full day's wages. It sat behind locked glass in apothecary shops, guarded like a precious metal, doled out in careful spoonfuls to those who could afford it. 90 years later, that same substance had become so ordinary that factory workers were stirring it into their tea 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day without a second thought. No commodity in human history has traveled a stranger road, from sacred medicine to royal trophy to the fuel of empires to the quiet poison hiding in almost everything we eat. This is the story of how a wild grass from a Pacific jungle rewired the human diet, financed the rise and fall of nations, built the transatlantic slave trade, and is, at this very moment, sitting in your kitchen cupboard, waiting to be noticed.
To understand how sugar conquered the world, we have to go back roughly 10,000 years, long before writing, before cities, before the wheel, to the humid lowlands of New Guinea. New Guinea sits in the South Pacific, a land of dense rainforest, volcanic soil, and extraordinary biodiversity. It was here, botanists believe, that early Melanesian communities first noticed a tall, jointed grass growing wild along riverbanks and forest clearings. The plant had a thick, fibrous stalk, and when people split it open and chewed the pulp inside, they discovered something the human tongue had likely never experienced in such concentrated form: pure, intense sweetness, released directly from a plant rather than gathered drop by drop from a beehive. That plant was Saccharum officinarum, wild sugarcane. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests it was domesticated in New Guinea sometime between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, making it one of the very first plants humans deliberately cultivated. For thousands of years afterward, its use barely changed. People cut the cane, peeled back the tough outer rind, and simply chewed the fibrous interior, spitting out the pulp once they had extracted the juice. There was no boiling, no crystallization, no trade network. It was a treat, a source of quick energy, something closer to fruit than to the substance we know today.
Slowly, generation after generation, island-hopping traders and migrating farmers carried cane cuttings westward through Southeast Asia, into what is now Indonesia, the Philippines, and mainland Southeast Asia, planting it wherever the tropical climate allowed. This migration took centuries, moving at the pace of dugout canoes and footpaths rather than ships and roads. By around 3500 BC, sugarcane had reached the Indian subcontinent, carried along ancient trade and migration routes that connected South and Southeast Asia. And it was in India that everything changed. Somewhere in the Gangetic Plain, likely sometime in the first millennium BC, Indian farmers made a discovery that would alter the course of world history. They figured out that if you crushed the cane, boiled the extracted juice down, and let it cool, the liquid would crystallize into a hard, grainy, brownish solid. Sanskrit texts refer to this substance as khanda, a word that eventually traveled through Persian and Arabic into medieval Latin and Old French, and finally into English as candy. A related term, sharkara, meaning gravel or grit in reference to the coarse crystal texture, became the root of the modern word sugar by way of Arabic sucker and Old French souk.
This was not a small technical trick. It was the invention of sugar as an object, something that could be dried, stored in jars, carried across deserts on the backs of camels, and traded for months without spoiling. Sugarcane juice ferments and rots within days. Crystallized sugar can last for years. India had turned a perishable jungle plant into a durable commodity, and in doing so, created an entirely new category of trade good. Ayurvedic medical texts from ancient India, including sections later compiled into works like the Charaka Samhita, describe sugar and its byproducts with something close to reverence. Physicians prescribed it for weakness, digestive trouble, wound healing, and a range of other ailments. It was classified among valuable medicinal substances, not treated as a food in the way we think of it now. For the ordinary farmer or laborer of ancient India, refined sugar remained a luxury. It was the elite, the temple complexes, and the healers who had regular access to it. Word of this strange honey without bees eventually reached the Mediterranean world through one of history's most famous military campaigns. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great pushed his armies into the Indus Valley. Among his officers was a naval commander named Nearchus, who was later credited by Greek historians, including Strabo, with describing a reed in India capable of producing a sweet substance without any assistance from bees. To the Greeks, whose only concentrated sweetener was honey, painstakingly gathered from wild hives, the idea of sweetness pouring out of a grass stalk sounded almost like... And yet, for centuries, that was largely all it remained to the Western world. A rumor, a curiosity mentioned in travelers' accounts. Sugar was too far away, too difficult to transport, and too fragile in its unrefined forms to become anything more than an exotic footnote in Greek and early Roman life. By the time sugar did begin trickling into the Roman world, centuries after Alexander, it arrived not as food, but as medicine, sold in small quantities through apothecaries alongside other rare imported substances. Roman and later Byzantine physicians used it in remedies for stomach ailments and eye complaints, following medical traditions that had themselves been shaped by Persian and Indian medical knowledge passing westward along trade routes. Its price reflected its scarcity. Contemporary accounts describe a pound of sugar costing something on the order of a month's wages for an ordinary laborer, a price that placed it firmly outside the reach of anyone but the wealthy or the aristocratic sick. This state of affairs, sugar as an expensive imported medicine rather than a food, persisted across Europe for roughly 1,000 years. What changed it was not a shift in European tastes, but a transformation happening far to the east and south, in the heartlands of the early Islamic world.
Between the 7th and 13th centuries, during the period historians often call the Islamic Golden Age, Arab and Persian scholars, engineers, and merchants took the raw agricultural knowledge inherited from India and transformed it into an industrial and scientific discipline. Muslim agronomists carried sugarcane cultivation westward out of Persia and Mesopotamia, adapting irrigation techniques to grow the crop in far drier climates than it had ever tolerated before, across Persia, Iraq, the Levant, Egypt, and eventually along the North African coast and into southern Spain and Sicily. Just as importantly, Arab chemists refined the processing methods themselves. They developed multi-stage boiling and clarifying techniques, using lime and other purifying agents to produce crystals that were whiter, harder, finer, and longer lasting than the coarse brown khanda India had traditionally produced. Sugar mills, some powered by animal labor, others increasingly by water wheels, sprang up across the Islamic world, alongside a genuine trade infrastructure, merchants, shipping routes, and markets that moved refined sugar from Persia and Egypt outward across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds. Medical scholars, such as those in the tradition of Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, wrote about sugar's medicinal properties, cementing its place in Islamic pharmacology, while cookbooks from the period show it beginning to appear in confections and sweetened dishes served at the tables of the wealthy. By the time European crusaders marched into the Levant, beginning in 1096,
sugar was already a well-established part of Middle Eastern medicine, cuisine, and commerce. For the crusaders, encountering it for the first time was a revelation. Chroniclers described it as an almost magical substance, and returning knights carried bags of it home to Europe, alongside relics, spices, and other treasures looted or purchased in the East. From this point forward, European demand for sugar only grew, and grew faster than Europe's ability to supply itself. Sitting at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, the maritime Republic of Venice was perfectly positioned to exploit this growing appetite. Venetian merchants built commercial relationships with sugar producers across the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, importing raw and semi-refined sugar, processing it further in refineries on Venetian territory, and distributing it across the rest of Europe at enormous markups. For roughly 2 centuries, from the late medieval period into the early Renaissance, Venice held something close to a monopoly over the European sugar trade, and the fortunes built on that monopoly helped finance the city's extraordinary wealth, its palaces, and its naval power. In the courts of medieval and early Renaissance Europe, sugar became a symbol of status in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Wealthy households commissioned elaborate sugar sculptures, entire scenes cast in refined sugar paste as centerpieces for royal banquets, a practice that displayed both artistic craftsmanship and, more importantly, the sheer expense the host was willing to burn for a single evening's spectacle. English royal households kept meticulous inventories of their sugar stores, tracking it the way a modern treasury might track bullion. At the wedding celebrations of King Henry III in 1236, the royal household is recorded as having purchased sugar in quantities that would have cost more than a knight earned in an entire year. Apothecaries stored it under lock and key alongside opium, exotic spices, and other costly imports, prescribed it for everything from persistent coughs to melancholy. If a household could regularly afford sugar, everyone around them knew it. If it could not, sugar likely never touched their table at all. But European sugar consumption faced a hard physical limit. Sugarcane is a tropical and subtropical crop. It does not tolerate frost. It cannot be grown in England, in France, in the Low Countries, or anywhere across most of the continent that was clamoring for it.
Every grain of sugar reaching European tables had to travel along a long, expensive, and politically vulnerable trade route controlled by merchants and rulers in the Islamic world. As European demand climbed through the late medieval period, this dependency became increasingly intolerable to European monarchs and merchant classes hungry for a supply chain they could control outright.
In the early 1400s, Portuguese sailors and settlers, backed by the royal house of Aviz, began colonizing a string of Atlantic islands: Madeira, the Azores, the Canary Islands, contested with Castile, and later the equatorial island of São Tomé off the coast of West Africa. Portuguese agronomists quickly recognized that several of these islands, Madeira in particular, and later São Tomé, offered a nearly ideal climate for sugarcane: warm, humid, and free of the killing frosts that made cultivation impossible on the European mainland. Portugal established what were, in effect, the first European-owned and European-operated sugar plantations, and almost immediately ran into a labor problem. Growing sugarcane is one thing, processing it is another. The crop has to be cut and crushed within a very narrow window after harvest, or the juice spoils and the sugar content is lost, meaning that during harvest season, labor demands become brutal and constant, often stretching to 18 or 20 hours a day of back-breaking work in tropical heat. Portuguese planters first tried using convict labor and impoverished European settlers. It did not work. The death and desertion rates were too high, and the supply of willing or coercible European labor was far too small to meet the industry's needs. So Portuguese planters turned instead to captive labor, drawn from the West African coast, a practice that had already existed on a smaller scale within African societies and Mediterranean slave markets, but which the sugar plantations of São Tomé scaled into something new. A system built specifically around the mass importation, exploitation, and rapid replacement of enslaved African laborers to keep sugar mills running around the clock. São Tomé's plantations became, in effect, a grim prototype, a testing ground for the labor system that would later be exported across the Atlantic on an almost unimaginable scale. When Christopher Columbus sailed on his second voyage to the Americas in 1493, he carried with him sugarcane cuttings from the Canary Islands, planting them in the soil of Hispaniola. The Caribbean, it turned out, offered everything sugarcane needed: consistent warmth, ample rainfall, and, crucially, from the perspective of European colonizers, land that had been catastrophically depopulated of its indigenous inhabitants by the diseases, violence, and forced labor that accompanied European conquest. The stage was set for the Caribbean to become, over the following 3 centuries, the epicenter of the global sugar trade. To understand why sugar became so deeply entangled with slavery, it helps to understand exactly what producing it actually required, hour by hour, on a plantation.
Enslaved workers cut mature cane by hand using machetes, working in extreme heat under the constant threat of violence from overseers. Because cut cane begins losing its sugar content almost immediately, the stalks had to be rushed to the mill and crushed within hours. Mills were powered by oxen, by water wheels, or later by windmills, and during the harvest season, which could stretch for months, they ran continuously, day and night. Workers fed raw cane by hand into heavy iron or wooden rollers, and the work was as dangerous as it sounds. Fingers, hands, and entire arms could be pulled into the rollers in an instant. Some plantations kept hatchets mounted near the machinery specifically so that a trapped limb could be severed quickly before the machine dragged the entire body through. The crushed juice then moved to the boiling house, where it was reduced through a sequence of increasingly hot copper kettles until it thickened and began to crystallize. Boiling houses were notoriously brutal workplaces, with air temperatures regularly exceeding 140 degrees Fahrenheit near the kettles. Splashes of boiling, syrupy sugar caused severe burns, and the combination of exhaustion, heat, and around-the-clock shifts during harvest season made the boiling house one of the most feared workstations on any plantation. This was the daily reality behind the refined white sugar that eventually reached European tea tables, a reality almost entirely invisible to the consumers who sweetened their drinks.
Over the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all raced to plant sugar colonies across the Caribbean and coastal South America. Brazil, colonized by Portugal, became one of the earliest and largest sugar producers in the Americas during the 1500s and 1600s. As English and French colonization expanded into the Caribbean through the 17th century, islands such as Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, and Cuba were transformed almost entirely into single-purpose sugar production machines. Barbados,
An island smaller than many modern American counties became one of the 17th century's most valuable pieces of real estate on the strength of sugar alone. By the mid-1600s, English planters there had adopted intensive Brazilian-style sugar production techniques and turned the small island into an extraordinarily profitable colony. So profitable that, for a period, it was regarded by the English crown and merchant class as more valuable than England's mainland North American colonies combined, despite Barbados's minuscule size. The human cost of this boom is almost impossible to fully convey in
numbers, but historians have tried. Across the full span of the transatlantic slave trade, from the early 1500s to the 1800s, an estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced aboard European and American ships and transported across the Atlantic. Roughly 10.7 million are believed to have survived the crossing. A large share of those who survived were funneled directly into sugar production in Brazil and the Caribbean, the single largest destination for enslaved labor in the Americas. Conditions on Caribbean sugar plantations were so severe, driven by relentless labor demands, tropical disease, malnutrition, and brutal discipline, that historians estimate the average life expectancy of a newly arrived enslaved person on a sugar plantation was shockingly short, often cited at only a handful of years after arrival. Plantation account books from the period reveal a chilling economic logic behind this. Many owners calculated in explicit financial terms that it was cheaper to work in
people to the point of death and purchase replacements than to invest in the food, rest, and medical care that might have extended their lives and productivity. Sugar did not merely benefit from the transatlantic slave trade. It was, in large part, the economic engine that made that trade so relentlessly profitable and so central to European colonial strategy for 3 centuries. A planter's decision to grow cane instead of tobacco or cotton on a given Caribbean island was, in retrospect, a decision that helped define global economics, migration, and human suffering for generations. The Dutch, meanwhile, carved out their own corner of this brutal economy. Having briefly controlled parts of northeastern Brazil in the mid-1600s, Dutch colonists and financiers absorbed detailed knowledge of Brazilian sugar technology, and after being pushed out by the Portuguese, carried that expertise directly into the Caribbean, helping English and French planters in Barbados and elsewhere adopt more efficient milling and boiling techniques. Dutch merchants and financiers also became central to financing the plantation economy itself, extending credit to planters, insuring cargo ships, and running much of the shipping that moved sugar, enslaved people, and finished goods between the various points of the Atlantic trade. Amsterdam, alongside London and Bordeaux grew into one of Europe's great sugar refining centers, its refineries processing raw Caribbean cane sugar into the white crystals that would eventually reach tables across the continent. By the 1700s, sugar had eclipsed tobacco, cotton, and virtually every other Atlantic commodity in total trade value. The profits it generated built grand townhouses in London, Bristol, Bordeaux, and Amsterdam, funded the expansion of European navies, and helped bankroll several of the era's major wars. Sugar sat at the center of what historians often call the triangular trade. European manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, metal tools, were shipped to West Africa and traded for captives. Those captives were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the Americas under horrific conditions. And Caribbean sugar, along with related products like rum and molasses, was shipped back to Europe to be refined, consumed, and re-exported. Every leg of that triangle was financed by and dependent on the sugar economy. Nowhere was the appetite for sugar more voracious than in England. Around the year 1700, the average English person consumed roughly 4 pounds of sugar annually. By 1800, that figure had climbed to somewhere in the range of 18 pounds per person per year, a more than 4-fold increase within. This surge in consumption was not simply organic consumer preference. British merchants, sugar planters, and allied politicians actively promoted sugar consumption at home, recognizing that rising domestic demand meant rising profits for the colonial plantation system that was, by this point, deeply woven into Britain's economic and political establishment. Sugar's Atlantic economy also generated valuable byproducts that reinforced the entire system. Molasses, the thick, dark residue left over after sugar crystals were extracted, was itself a major trade good, shipped in enormous quantities to New England, where colonial distillers turned it into rum. That rum, in turn, was often shipped to West Africa and used as a trade good in the purchase of captives, closing yet another loop in the broader triangular trade, and ensuring that virtually no part of the sugarcane plant, or the human suffering behind it, went to economic waste. Sugar had, in effect, spawned an entire secondary industry of distilling and shipping. That further entrenched New England's merchant economy in the machinery of Caribbean slavery. It is also worth noting that sugar rarely traveled alone. Across the 17th and 18th centuries, it arrived in Europe alongside two other increasingly popular imported stimulants: coffee, spreading from the Arab world and Ottoman Empire into European coffee houses, and cocoa, brought back from Mesoamerica by Spanish colonizers. Tea, coffee, and chocolate were all in their unsweetened forms, bitter or astringent. Sugar was what made all three palatable to the European mass market, and demand for one often drove demand for the others. In this sense, sugar functioned as something like the connective tissue of an entire new category of consumer goods, Europe's first taste of a genuinely globalized, addictive commodity culture. Yet the same brutal system that generated such enormous wealth also generated something the colonial powers desperately did not want: organized, sustained resistance. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, occupying the western third of the island of Hispaniola, had by the late 18th century become the single most profitable colony in the world, producing roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe, almost entirely through the forced labor of enslaved Africans working under conditions considered exceptionally brutal even by the standards of Caribbean plantation slavery. In August 1791, enslaved workers across Saint-Domingue's northern plain rose up in a coordinated revolt, setting plantations ablaze and beginning what would become the only permanently successful large-scale slave uprising in recorded history. Over the following
The shockwaves from Haiti's revolution traveled straight into the halls of power in Paris. France had lost, almost overnight, its most valuable overseas possession, the colony that had underwritten a significant share of French colonial revenue. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had harbored ambitions of rebuilding a French sugar and territorial empire in the Americas, with Louisiana intended as a mainland supply base supporting the Caribbean colonies, found that ambition suddenly hollowed out. Without Haiti as the crown jewel of a reconstituted French-American empire, holding on to the vast, sparsely settled Louisiana territory no longer made strategic or financial sense, particularly with war against Britain looming again in Europe and the British Royal Navy threatening French shipping across the Atlantic. In 1803, Napoleon's government sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for roughly $15 million, a sum that worked out to just a few cents per acre, instantly more than doubling the size of the young United States. Historians generally agree that the collapse of French colonial ambitions in Haiti was one of the central factors, though not the only one, pushing Napoleon toward that sale. In a very real sense, an uprising on Caribbean sugar plantations helped redraw the map of North America.
13 years, the revolution evolved into a complex, multi-sided war involving formerly enslaved insurgents under leaders such as Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, alongside French colonial forces invading Spanish and British armies seeking to exploit the chaos and shifting alliances between all of them. By January 1804, the rebels had defeated Napoleon's expeditionary force and declared independence, renaming the colony Haiti, an indigenous Taino name for the island, and establishing the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere, and only the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States.
At roughly the same time, Britain's naval blockade of French ports during the Napoleonic Wars was cutting off France's access to Caribbean cane sugar almost entirely, creating a domestic supply crisis and pushing Napoleon toward an entirely different solution: growing sugar at home. Decades earlier, in 1747, the German chemist Andreas Sigismund Markgraf had identified that the common beet, a temperate climate root vegetable that grew easily across northern and central Europe, contained sucrose chemically identical to that found in tropical sugarcane. For decades, this discovery remained a scientific curiosity, refined and expanded upon by Markgraf's student Franz Karl Eckard, who by the 1780s and 1790s had developed early industrial methods for extracting usable quantities of sugar from beets. But the concentrations were low, and cane sugar remained far cheaper as long as Atlantic trade routes stayed open. Once the British blockade made cane sugar scarce and expensive, Napoleon threw the resources of the French state behind beet sugar as a strategic necessity. He ordered tens of thousands of acres planted with sugar beets across France, offered financial incentives to farmers willing to convert their fields, and established dedicated research institutions and experimental sugar beet refineries to improve extraction techniques and boost yields. The program succeeded
Far beyond a stopgap wartime measure, by the 1810s, French beet sugar production had become a genuine industry, and other European nations soon followed France's lead, planting their own beet crops. For the first time in roughly 10,000 years,
Sugar was no longer a strictly tropical product. The near-total monopoly that cane-growing regions had held over global sweetness was permanently broken, and a new century-long rivalry began between tropical cane sugar and temperate beet sugar, a competition that, over time, helped drive global sugar prices steadily downward. The 19th century's industrial transformation accelerated sugar spread even further. Steam-powered crushing mills processed cane far faster and more efficiently than animal or water power ever could. Railroads moved harvested cane from field to factory in hours rather than days, dramatically reducing spoilage and cutting production costs. Refining techniques advanced to the point where manufacturers could produce sugar crystals of a whiteness and fineness that would have been unrecognizable compared to the coarse brown khanda first crystallized in ancient India. This gave rise to a curious cultural inversion. Pure white sugar, the most heavily processed version of the product, came to be seen as the premium, pure option, a symbol of modern refinement, while less processed brown sugar, despite retaining more of the plant's original trace minerals, was increasingly regarded as an inferior, old-fashioned alternative, even though the two were functionally almost identical in caloric and nutritional terms. It was during this same period that sugar found its most consequential cultural partnership, tea. Britain had been importing enormous quantities of tea from China since the 17th century, but tea on its own carries a notably bitter, astringent taste. Adding sugar transformed it into something the rapidly growing industrial working class found genuinely pleasant and, more importantly, affordable enough to drink multiple times a day. By the mid-1800s, ordinary British workers were commonly drinking 2 or more cups of heavily sweetened tea daily, and sugar imports into Britain roughly doubled between 1840 and 1860 as beet sugar competition and colonial supply expansion pushed prices down further. The British government actively lowered tariffs on imported sugar during this period, driven in part by a recognition, voiced explicitly by some contemporary officials and industrialists, that cheap, energy-dense sweetened tea helped keep an increasingly urbanized industrial workforce fed, alert, and productive at minimal cost to employers. By the closing decades of the 19th century, sugar had worked its way into nearly every corner of the Western working-class diet. Jam spread thickly on bread, penny candies sold from corner shops, baked goods, and sweetened beverages had all become everyday staples rather than rare treats. There was a hard economic logic underneath this shift. Factory laborers working 12 to 14-hour shifts needed calories, and sugar delivered fast, cheap energy more efficiently than almost any other food available at the time. Industrial employers had every incentive to encourage this pattern. Sweetened tea and jam sandwiches kept workers moving through long shifts without requiring employers to provide more substantial and more expensive meals. Sugar had effectively become one of the quiet fuels of industrial capitalism itself. As early as the 1950s and into the 1960s, emerging scientific research was beginning to draw connections between high sugar consumption and cardiovascular disease. Rather than confronting this research openly, the sugar industry moved to shape the scientific conversation itself. In 1965, a trade association called the Sugar Research Foundation, the organization known today as the Sugar Association, quietly approached Dr. Frederick Stare, chair of Harvard's Department of Nutrition, and commissioned what became known internally as Project 226, a literature review on sugar, dietary fat, and heart disease. Correspondence uncovered decades later shows that the Sugar Research Foundation paid Stare and 2 Harvard colleagues, Mark Hegsted and Robert McGandy, the equivalent of roughly $49,000 in today's money for the review. And crucially, the foundation itself selected which studies the Harvard researchers would examine and reviewed drafts of the article before publication. The resulting review, published in 1967 in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most respected medical journals in the world, concluded that the evidence linking sugar to heart disease was weak, and instead,
Today, the average American consumes somewhere around 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day, while the American Heart Association recommends no more than roughly 6 teaspoons for women and 9 for men, meaning many people are consuming something on the order of double to triple the recommended limit, often without realizing it, because added sugar hides in places consumers rarely think to check. Pasta sauce, bread, salad dressing, flavored yogurt, and granola bars among them. A single serving of flavored yogurt can ounce for ounce contain more sugar than a chocolate candy bar. A standard can of regular soda alone can carry roughly 10 teaspoons of sugar, more than an entire day's recommended limit in a single drink. The public health consequences of this shift have been severe. More than 4 in 10 American adults are now classified as obese. tens of millions of Americans live with diagnosed diabetes, and tens of millions more are estimated to have prediabetes. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the United States, and while sugar is far from the only contributing factor, a substantial and growing body of research identifies it as one of the most significant.
While the fallout from decades of fat-focused dietary guidance was still unfolding, an entirely new form of sugar was quietly reshaping the American food supply from a different direction. In the early 1970s, building on Japanese enzymatic research into converting starch into sugar, American food scientists refined a commercially viable process for converting cornstarch into high-fructose corn syrup, a cheap liquid sweetener that could be produced domestically in enormous volumes, thanks in large part to generous U.S. government subsidies for corn production that had left American farmers growing far more corn than direct food and feed markets required. High-fructose corn syrup offered food and beverage manufacturers real practical advantages. It was substantially cheaper than imported or domestically refined cane and beet sugar, it was easier to transport and store as a liquid, and it blended more smoothly into beverages and processed foods. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and PepsiCo had switched the sweetener in their American products from cane and beet sugar to high-fructose corn syrup. Within roughly a decade, it had displaced traditional sugar in the overwhelming majority of processed foods and beverages sold in the United States, a shift most American consumers were entirely unaware had even happened at the time.
The health toll of a century of rising sugar consumption eventually gave rise to an entire industry built around avoiding sugar altogether while still chasing its taste. Artificial sweeteners, such as saccharin, discovered by accident in a Johns Hopkins laboratory in 1879, and later aspartame and sucralose, developed across the 20th century, offered manufacturers a way to sweeten products with a fraction of the calories, and diet sodas built entirely around this promise became a major category of their own by the 1980s and 1990s. More recently, extracts from the stevia plant and monk fruit have been marketed as natural zero-calorie alternatives, part of a broader consumer shift toward reading nutrition labels and actively seeking out reduced sugar or sugar-free versions of familiar products. Major food and beverage companies, facing mounting public pressure, changing regulations, and new taxes in multiple countries, have in recent years reformulated thousands of products to cut sugar content, a direct echo of the reformulation wave that followed the United Kingdom's 2018 sugar levy. Whether any of these substitutes fully resolve the underlying relationship between